everyone agrees boundaries are healthy. It's become one of those words that functions less like a concept and more like a password. Say it, and the conversation is supposed to nod along in agreement. What almost nobody mentions is what it actually feels like the first time you enforce one with someone you love. It doesn't feel healthy. It feels closer to committing a small act of violence against them and against the relationship as it currently exists. That feeling, the one nobody warns you about, is the actual reason most people never follow through. Not because they don't understand the concept, not because they lack the vocabulary. There are entire industries now supplying the vocabulary. They stall at the exact moment the guilt arrives, and they interpret that guilt as proof that something has gone wrong. It hasn't. The guilt was never the warning sign. It was the toll. What a boundary actually is. Before going further, the term itself needs to be rescued from what it's become, because a lot of what circulates under the name boundaries isn't boundaries at all. A boundary, properly defined, is a statement about your own behavior. I won't discuss finances after 10 at night. I'm not available to talk when I've been drinking. I will leave the room if the conversation turns to yelling. Notice the structure. Every real boundary is a sentence with you as the subject and your own future action as the content. It doesn't require the other person to change anything. It only requires you to follow through on what you said you'd do. An ultimatum is a different sentence, wearing the same word. Stop talking to your mother about this, or I'm leaving. You need to apologize by tonight, or we're done. The subject has quietly shifted. It's no longer about your behavior. It's a demand about someone else's behavior, backed by a threat. And it gets called a boundary constantly, particularly in the wave of pop therapy content circulating on social platforms, where the word has increasingly become a socially acceptable justification for cutting people off or avoiding accountability entirely, rather than a tool for staying in relationship with someone while protecting something real. This confusion matters because it changes what the guilt is actually responding to. An ultimatum genuinely is a kind of coercion. And if what you're feeling guilty about is an ultimatum, the guilt might be worth listening to as information. But a real boundary, correctly defined, coerces no one. It only tells the truth about what you will and won't continue to participate in. And people still feel violent guilt enforcing it. That's the part worth actually explaining, because it isn't about whether the boundary is fair. It's about what the boundary does to the system it's being enforced inside of. The system doesn't want to change. Psychiatrist Murray Bowen's family systems theory offers the clearest account of why this is so hard, and it starts from a premise most boundary content skips entirely. A relationship isn't two independent people occasionally interacting. It's a system. And systems, once established, settle into a stable equilibrium, a working balance that both people have, often unconsciously, adapted around and come to rely on, however dysfunctional that balance might actually be. Bowen's concept of differentiation of self describes the capacity to maintain a clear sense of your own thoughts, values, and identity, while remaining emotionally connected to people close to you, rather than either fusing completely with their expectations or cutting off from them entirely to protect yourself. Low differentiation looks like automatically absorbing other people's emotional states as though they were your own, unable to hold a position that makes someone else uncomfortable without immediately collapsing it. Higher differentiation means being able to stay connected to someone, stay in the room, stay in the relationship, while still holding a position they don't like. Here's why this matters for boundaries specifically. Any change introduced into a relational system, even a healthy, overdue, obviously necessary change, registers to that system as a disruption of the existing equilibrium. Bowen's framework predicts that systems will generate anxiety in response to that disruption and will exert pressure, often not consciously or maliciously, to pull the system back toward its previous familiar balance. This is why the first time you enforce a real boundary, the other person's reaction is so often disproportionate to the actual size of the request. You asked for something modest, reasonable, even by their own account, and you're met with hurt, anger, distance, guilt-inducing silence, a full system-level alarm going off in response to what looks on paper like a small adjustment. The system isn't overreacting to the boundary itself. It's reacting to the fact that its equilibrium has just been touched. And equilibrium, once disturbed, generates resistance almost automatically, regardless of how reasonable the disturbance was. You feel that resistance. You feel it as guilt because you're the one who introduced the disruption. And disruption inside a system you're still emotionally embedded in doesn't feel like health. It feels like damage, even when it isn't. Guilt is not the same thing as shame. This is the distinction that changes how the entire feeling should be interpreted. And it's the piece almost no boundaries content actually explains, because most of it treats bad feelings as a single undifferentiated category to be minimized as quickly as possible. Psychologist June Tangney's research on self-conscious emotions draws a sharp, well-documented line between guilt and shame, and the distinction is structural, not just a matter of intensity. Shame is the belief that I am bad, a global indictment of the self as a whole. Guilt is the belief that I did something that had a cost, a specific contained judgment about a particular action, rather than about your entire character. Tangney's research found these two emotions behave very differently and produce very different downstream consequences. Shame tends to correlate with withdrawal, defensiveness, and a paradoxical increase in the very behaviors it's meant to discourage. Because when the self as a whole feels condemned, the instinct is to protect that self rather than to engage further. Guilt, by contrast, tends to correlate with reparative action, with continued engagement, with taking responsibility, precisely because the self isn't what's under attack, just a specific choice. The guilt that shows up when you enforce a real boundary is structurally this second kind. It is not telling you that you are a bad person for having limits. It's registering accurately that your action has a real cost, that someone you care about is disappointed or hurt or inconvenienced, and that this cost is genuinely happening, not imagined. That registration is accurate, it's just being misread. The mistake most people make is treating the presence of guilt as evidence that the boundary itself was wrong, when the guilt is actually just confirming that the boundary was real. A fake boundary, one that costs the other person nothing, one that changes nothing about the existing equilibrium, wouldn't generate this feeling in the first place because it wouldn't be disrupting anything. This is the piece worth sitting with directly. If enforcing a limit costs you nothing in guilt, it likely wasn't disrupting the system enough to function as an actual boundary. The guilt isn't a bug in the process, it's closer to a receipt, proof that something real just changed. The anxiety of being the one who moves first. There's a further layer to this worth naming specifically, because it explains why boundary enforcement often feels worse the first time than it does the 10th time, even when the content of the boundary hasn't changed at all. Inside Bowen's systems framework, the person who first introduces a change is, briefly, the most exposed person in the system. Everyone else's behavior has been calibrated, consciously or not, around the previous equilibrium. And for a period after the disruption, the system doesn't yet know what its new equilibrium will look like. That uncertainty generates a specific acute form of anxiety in the person who moved first. Distinct from ordinary discomfort, closer to the feeling of having said something in a quiet room that can't be unsaid, waiting to find out what happens next before there's any way to know. This is why the first enforcement of a boundary so often feels disproportionately, almost absurdly, heavy relative to what was actually said. It's not really an isolated reaction to a single sentence. It's the felt experience of temporarily destabilizing a system and holding that destabilization open without yet knowing whether the relationship will resettle into something workable or not. Most people encountering that specific anxiety for the first time misread it as proof of catastrophe, rather than as a known transitional phase, and abandon the boundary right in the middle of it, which reinforces the exact dynamic that made the boundary necessary. The system learns through the retreat that enough resistance will reliably produce a reversal, and the next attempt at a boundary becomes harder, not easier, because now the system has direct evidence that holding out works. What actually happens on the other side? None of this is an argument for pushing through recklessly or treating every relationship's resistance as automatically illegitimate. Some resistance is telling you something true and important about a relationship that genuinely isn't safe or reciprocal. But for the very large number of boundaries that are legitimate, reasonable, and simply new, the systems framework predicts something specific and worth knowing in advance. The acute anxiety is time-limited. Systems that are fundamentally capable of adapting do eventually resettle around a new equilibrium that includes the boundary, and the intensity of the reaction on day one is not a reliable predictor of what the relationship looks like a month later, once the new balance has had time to form. This is the part boundary-setting content almost never says out loud, because it's less immediately reassuring than a 5-step framework. It is going to feel bad, specifically and predictably bad, the first time. And that badness is not information about whether you're allowed to do it. It's the felt cost of being the person who moved first inside a system that hadn't finished calibrating around the old normal yet, waiting for the guilt to disappear before acting, is waiting for a precondition that was never going to arrive on its own, because the guilt was never a stop sign. It was always going to be the toll charged for changing something real. So the next time a boundary, is reasonable, one that only describes your own behavior, one that asks nothing of anyone else, still produces a wave of guilt heavy enough to make you want to take it back, it's worth pausing on what that guilt is actually reporting. It isn't telling you that you've hurt someone unfairly. It's telling you that the system noticed that something in the equilibrium just shifted, and shifted because of you, and hasn't finished resettling yet. That discomfort was never the sign you'd gotten it wrong. It was the closest thing you were going to get to proof that you'd finally gotten it right.